Hello YouTube. In this video we're going to look at the question, are there non-existent objects? Well, when you initially see this question it might seem like the answer is rather trivial, but the response can go in one of two ways here. So we might say, well, yes, of course there are non-existent objects. We can all list off things that don't exist. Sherlock Holmes, Zeus, round squares, golden mountains, the planet Gallifrey, faster than light drives, phlogiston, the luminiferous ether. None of these things exist, so of course there are non-existent objects. On the other hand, the claim that there are non-existent objects has the air of paradox about it. There are objects that don't exist, but to say that there is something implies that this thing exists. After all, if I were to tell you that there is a golden mountain, or that there is a spacecraft that has a faster-than-light drive, you'd think I was mad. Of course there aren't such things. So, if we're being more careful, then perhaps what we should say is, no, there are no non-existent objects. So this question, are there non-existent objects, is it's something that arises in the early years of analytic philosophy, and in the later years. It's a debate that's continued. The general consensus is that there are no non-existent objects. Everything there is exists. The view that there are non-existent objects is known as Meinongianism, after Alexius Meinong, who's shown here in the picture. The Meinongian says that some things do not exist. Existence is a property which some objects have and some objects lack. Moreover, we can refer to non-existent objects and make true statements about them. So, speaking completely unrestrictedly, there is a golden mountain. It's just that the golden mountain does not have the property of existence. It's not among the existing objects. But there is a golden mountain, and it's true that the golden mountain is golden. The repository of non-existent objects is often called Meinong's jungle, after Meinong, of course. Meinong's jungle, that's all the non-existent objects. Now, I should say that Meinong's own theory of objects was fairly complex. We're not going to look at the details of Meinong's theory here. We're going to look just at the claim that there are non-existent objects. So Meinongianism, right? We're just defining that as these two commitments that I've just outlined here. We're going to look at some of the motivations for this view and some of its problems. All right, well, why then should we take Meinongianism seriously? Why think that there are non-existent objects? So, to motivate this position, we can start by considering a seemingly commonsensical theory of reference and meaning. So, consider the statement, Frank Zappa was a musician. This proposition is true, right? Now, what makes it true? Well, here's a natural thought. The name Frank Zappa picks out an object in the world, right? The name is a kind of label that stands for an object. Musician then picks out a property, right? There are various things that are musicians and various things that are not musicians, and it so happens that the object denoted by the name Frank Zappa has the property denoted by the word musician. So Frank Zappa was a musician, hence the statement is true. Or if I say Frank Zappa was a chemist, the statement is false. Why is it false? Well, because the object denoted by the name Frank Zappa does not have the property denoted by the word chemist. So the general idea is that a meaningful subject-predicate sentence is meaningful in virtue of the fact that the subject denotes an object and then the predicate ascribes a property to that object. And this natural thought works not just for language, but for intentional states more generally. So in philosophy of mind, intentionality is a feature of some mental states. It's the ability of minds to be about things, or to represent things, or to be directed towards things. For instance, I admire Frank Zappa. So my mental state, my state of admiration is about Frank Zappa. It's directed towards Frank Zappa. It's like pointing at Zappa. Or I fear climate change, right? Like I have a mental state that's like pointing towards climate change. Or I suspect that the mouse is responsible for eating the cheese, right? My mental state is pointing at the mouse. So I don't just utter sentences about, say, Frank Zappa. I also have thoughts about Frank Zappa. And I suppose in some sense this is presumably more fundamental, right? Like we use language to express our thoughts. So, I have thoughts about Frank Zappa and then I express these thoughts using sentences. In any case, the thought is, look, when I have a thought about Frank Zappa, it seems like there's some kind of relation between my thought and Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa has the property of being thought of by me. When I admire Frank Zappa, I'm kind of mentally picking out an object and then I have a certain attitude towards it. My friend hates Frank Zappa. She's picking out the same object and she has a very different attitude towards it. So look, that's the simple picture. That's the simple picture. Unfortunately, there are some challenges that arise with this picture. Many of them come from apparent reference to non-existent objects. So think about the following. Sherlock Holmes is a detective. Well, this is clearly meaningful, and you'd probably be inclined to say that it's true, but true or false, it's certainly meaningful. Now we run into a problem, though. If this is meaningful, it's in virtue of the fact the subject denotes an object, and the predicate ascribes a property to the object, right? That's how the statement works at face value, but Sherlock Holmes does not denote anything that exists, right? Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. So how could this statement be true? I mean, how could it even be meaningful, right? Because Sherlock Holmes isn't denoting anything. So how can we make sense of this sentence? Or if I say, Sherlock Holmes is more famous than any real detective, well, I'm comparing Sherlock Holmes to real detectives. I can refer easily enough to real detectives, but there's nothing picked out by Sherlock Holmes. There's no detective. There's no detective that is Sherlock Holmes. So the comparison, how does that make any sense? Or consider questions like, who is Sherlock Holmes? Well, you'd probably answer this by describing the features of a person. You would say he was a detective who lived on Baker Street, who worked in the late 1800s and early 1900s, whose nemesis was James Moriarty, and so on. Like you'd give a substantial answer to that. Or other questions like, what is phlogiston? What is the planet Gallifrey? These questions have substantial answers. The answer in each case is not simply, well, nothing, right? If I say, who is Sherlock Holmes? And you just say, well, nothing, that doesn't seem right. But Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. There is no Sherlock Holmes. There is no phlogiston. There is no planet Gallifrey. So there's a slight paradox here. Similarly, people often have intentional mental states about things that don't exist. After watching a horror film, I may fear that my house is haunted by ghosts, but ghosts don't exist. I can imagine a unicorn, but there are no unicorns. So, we represent these non-existent things. We noted before that intentional states seem to involve a relation between the mental state and an object. But in these cases, given that the objects don't exist, I can't stand in any relation to them. I can't have an intentional state that picks out ghosts if there are no ghosts. This is the worry, right? This is the challenge. The sort of, I guess, a general difficulty here arises from a very plausible logical principle, existential generalization. So basically, this principle says that if A is F, then there exists something that is F. And I've symbolized it there, but, that's hopefully relatively simple, right? If A is F, then there exists something. The backwards E means there exists. There exists something that is F, right? If A is F, then there exists an X such that X is F. This seems very plausible. We're supposing that it is true of A that F applies to it, but then surely it must be true that F applies to something. But then if we're reading this as saying if A is F, then there exists something that is F, well, that clearly causes problems in the case of reference to non-existent things. Because in that case, when I say Zeus is a thunder god, well, that entails that there exist thunder gods, which is clearly false. But Zeus is a thunder god seems to be true. Certainly, Zeus is a thunder god. Well, yeah, Zeus is a thunder god. If I was to say Zeus is a thunder god, you'd sort of nod. If I say Zeus is a vulture, you'd say, well, no, Zeus isn't a vulture, he's a thunder god. So this is this is a problem, right? Now, the Meinongian says, well, look, there's a really simple solution to this. This isn't really a problem at all. There's a very simple answer to what's going on here, which is we can refer to and stand in relations with non-existent objects. So Sherlock Holmes, the name Sherlock Holmes, that does not denote an existing object, but it still denotes something. It denotes an object that does not exist. So when I say Sherlock Holmes is a detective, that's true in the straightforward way that a statement like Frank Zappa is a musician is true. Sherlock Holmes, the name, picks out an object, and that object does indeed have the property that is ascribed by the sentence. It's just that Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, and Frank Zappa does. On Meinong's view, for every intentional state, there is an object that this mental state is about. Some of these objects exist, some do not. So I can legitimately think about, admire, fear, refer to Sherlock Holmes. It's just Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. The Meinongian reinterprets existential generalization. Indeed, it's not really existential generalization at all. We're not committed to the existence of anything. So you sometimes hear it called other things like particular generalization. So really, what this says is, if A is F, then there is something that is F. So this is the difference, right? On the previous interpretation, we're saying if A is F, then there exists something that is F. But the Meinongian will say, well, no, if A is F, then there is something that is F. But that doesn't mean that there exists something that is F. Some objects don't exist. So we can't infer from A is F to there exists something that is F. We can only infer from A is F to something is F. Where the something may be a non-existent object. Now, at this point, a natural objection arises. Isn't there an easier answer to this apparent reference to non-existent objects, which is reference to ideas? So, when I fear a ghost, what's really going on is that I fear a kind of mental representation or idea, right? Like that's what my mental state is really directed towards. It's directed towards another mental state, not a non-existent object. So when I watch a horror film, this puts the idea of ghosts in my mind, and this is what is the object of my fear. Or when a scientist thinks about phlogiston, what's going on is, they came up with this theory, they came up with this representation, this idea, and so when they think about phlogiston, what they're really doing is thinking about, a representation of phlogiston or an idea of phlogiston. They're not thinking about a non-existent thing, a non-existent object. I want to note, though, so this is, again, this is a fairly intuitive thing to say, but there is a rather odd consequence with this. So a representation or an idea cannot haunt a house. It cannot harm me. It cannot move objects around and so on. But that's what I worry the ghost will do. Now, obviously we have to grant that, my fear of the ghost is a mental state. But it doesn't follow that my fear of the ghost is about a mental state. Indeed, it seems that it's not about a mental state. It's about a ghost. So maybe one way to put this is, it's important not to confuse the vehicle of a representation with the object of the representation. Of course, the vehicle of the representation is a mental state. Like when I fear a ghost, I'm in a mental state. But it doesn't follow that what is represented is a mental state. It doesn't follow that the representation is about a mental state. Indeed, we can compare this to the case of existing things. So I admire Frank Zappa. This is a mental state, right? My admiration of Frank Zappa is a mental state, but we wouldn't conclude that my admiration of Frank Zappa is about a mental state. No, it's about Frank Zappa. It's about the person, the real person in the world. The object of my thought is Frank Zappa himself. I'm not thinking about a thought. I'm thinking about Frank Zappa. So I think we should be cautious with this, with this intuitive answer. Indeed, another issue that's just worth mentioning here, that I think many philosophers would see with this intuitive answer, is that it appears to commit us to let's call it a veil of conception, where we can't even think about things beyond our own minds, which maybe raises some skeptical challenges. Anyway, won't go into that. I suppose, another way to look at this is, look, we have all sorts of beliefs about the world. Some of these beliefs are true, and some of these beliefs are false. We have all sorts of beliefs about what there is in the world. Sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong. People have thought about many things that turned out not to exist, such as ghosts, or phlogiston, or the planet Vulcan, or the luminiferous ether. Now, one of the sort of motivating ideas of Meinongianism is that even in cases where our beliefs about the world turn out to be false, and in cases where the things that we think exist don't exist, our words and meanings and thoughts should work in, broadly speaking, the same way. So, like, the existence of an object doesn't really make any difference to meaning or intentionality. So if you think about, these two statements, right? The door was opened by a ghost versus the door was opened by my brother, right? Or indeed compare these two statements. Vulcan is the closest planet to the sun versus Mercury is the closest planet to the sun. Well, okay, in each of these cases, one of these statements is true and the other is false. But the thought is the truth value doesn't really make any difference with respect to the meaning. It doesn't make any difference with respect to, like, how the statement works semantically. Broadly speaking, these statements should work in the same way. At least assuming I sincerely believe, like, let's say I sincerely believe in ghosts and I say the door was opened by a ghost. That's the same kind of statement as saying that the door was opened by my brother. My thoughts about ghosts are no more thoughts about ideas than my thoughts about my brother are thoughts about ideas. In both cases, what's going on is I'm denoting an object. When I say the door was opened by my brother, I'm denoting an object, my brother. When I say it was opened by a ghost, similarly, the Meinongian says, well, it should work the same way. I'm denoting an object, a ghost. When I say that Mercury is the closest planet to the sun, my statement denotes the object Mercury. When I say that Vulcan is the closest planet to the sun, my statement denotes the object Vulcan. So I think there's this sort of desire to give a kind of uniform account of these statements, of these sorts of statements. There's also, I think it's worth noting, a specific instance of apparent reference to non-existent objects that is often thought to raise particularly thorny issues, and this is the problem of negative existentials. So, consider the statement, Zeus does not exist. This statement is true. It is about Zeus. But suppose there are no non-existent objects. Then, if this statement is true, it seems it can't be about Zeus, because if it's true, there's no object denoted by the name Zeus. Or to put this another way, if Zeus successfully denotes an object, then Zeus exists in some sense. So the statement would be false. So it then seems we have no way to assert of any object that it does not exist, at least not without contradicting ourselves. And that doesn't look like the right result, because it seems like we want to say, no, it's true of many things. Like, I can say, such and such does not exist, and that can be true. Now, of course, the Meinongian has a very simple answer to this. We can denote objects that don't exist. Zeus denotes an object that does not exist. So the sentence, Zeus does not exist, that denotes an object, namely Zeus. It predicates a property of it, namely non-existence, and the object does indeed have that property. So Zeus does not exist is true, right? Zeus is a non-existent object. I should note that this case of negative existentials is particularly challenging for the idea I suggested a minute ago that when we're referring to ideas, that like Zeus refers to an idea. So suppose we say that the name Zeus denotes a representation or an idea. Well, in that case, it turns out that Zeus does not exist is false. Zeus does exist. It's just that Zeus has very different properties to what we might have attributed to him, or to it. Zeus is actually a kind of mental representation. Indeed, I mean, on this view, I suppose it's questionable whether it's ever possible to state a true negative existential. For any statement of the form, X does not exist, if that statement is meaningful, it will be because X successfully denotes a representation or idea, but then we would have to say that it does exist. So this is, these are some of the motivations for postulating non-existent objects. Tim Crane, in his article "What is the Problem of Non-Existence?", I think puts the issue quite nicely. He says, well, there's this sort of tension in our beliefs, in our like ordinary beliefs, where on the one hand, it seems like there are truths and falsehoods about non-existent things, right? It seems like we regularly refer to non-existent things and, we can regularly say true and false things about them. On the other hand, it seems like there's nothing more to reality than what exists. That, there are no non-existent things. All the truths are made true by things that exist. So we have these two intuitions that pull us in different directions. The Meinongian, of course, denies the second intuition. The Meinongian says, well, there are truths about non-existent objects, and those truths are made true by non-existent objects. And the Meinongian will claim her view gives us a very natural and straightforward analysis of semantics and intentionality with respect to non-existent things. So that's Meinongianism. That's the basic idea. Now, obviously, Meinongianism is not the only option on the table. Historically, Meinongianism was taken quite seriously in the early years of analytic philosophy, but it was then sort of demolished by Bertrand Russell. It hasn't really recovered since then. So Russell proposed an alternative solution to some of the problems that we've seen that dispenses with the need to postulate non-existent objects. And this is Russell's theory of description. So I'm just going to briefly outline this theory so you can kind of see how we might go about analyzing these sorts of cases without postulating non-existent objects, right? Like how does it work if we're not getting on board with Meinongianism? And of course there are many options here, right? There are many non-Meinongian theories, but I'm just going to briefly outline Russell's. I should note, by the way, that I have a video on Russell's theory that I made many years ago. So if you want more detail, you can go and check that out. My series on Russell's theory of descriptions. Okay, so here's how it works. First of all, Russell takes it that proper names are disguised descriptions. So the name Frank Zappa, it really means something like the writer of Joe's Garage. The name Zeus really means something like the king of the gods on Mount Olympus. Okay, so we have to take like any proper name, what's really going on is it's like actually just a description. So Frank Zappa equals the writer of Joe's Garage. Next, Russell argues that the underlying logical form of descriptions is quite different from their surface grammatical form. So suppose I say that the writer of Joe's Garage was a musician. On Russell's theory, this gets analysed as follows. There exists exactly one X such that X wrote Joe's Garage and X is a musician. More precisely, like at least one X wrote Joe's Garage, at most one X wrote Joe's Garage, and whichever X wrote Joe's Garage was a musician. So this is the logical form. This is what Russell says is being the proposition that's really being expressed by this sentence. When I say the writer of Joe's Garage was a musician, what I'm expressing is there exists exactly one X such that X wrote Joe's Garage and X was a musician. And I think you can see how that kind of fits, right? Now here's the thing: existence on this view is not a genuine property. So, or at least it's not a property of individuals. If I say that the writer of Joe's Garage exists, what this means is, so the writer of Joe's Garage exists really means there exists exactly one X such that X wrote Joe's Garage. And of course that's true, right? But we're not sort of denoting an object and then ascribing the property of existence to it, right? What we're saying is that, this is like, right, there exists exactly one X such that X wrote Joe's Garage, right? So we're saying that description is satisfied. Now, we noted at the beginning that it seems like we have these like straightforward subject-predicate sentences, right? Zeus is the father of Ares. But Russell's going to say, well, no, this form is misleading. So when I say Zeus is the father of Ares, right, what's really being asserted by that? I mean, there's going to be sort of two steps, right? First of all, we replace the proper name with a description. So we say the king of the gods on Mount Olympus is the father of Ares. And then the second step, we give this analysis of the description. So then we say from the king of the gods on Mount Olympus is the father of Ares, we get there exists exactly one X such that X kings the gods on Mount Olympus and X fathered Ares. And notice, this is perfectly meaningful, and this doesn't require us to refer to a non-existent object, right? When I say there exists exactly one X such that X kings the gods in Mount Olympus and X fathered Ares, well, I can just say, well, no, there's just nothing that satisfies that. But I'm not referring to some, I'm not like denoting some non-existent object. This also provides a neat answer to the problem of negative existentials. We take Zeus does not exist. We replace Zeus with a description. The king of the gods on Mount Olympus does not exist. Then we apply Russell's analysis of descriptions. Caution is required at this point because it's tempting to render it as saying there exists exactly one X such that X kings the gods on Mount Olympus and X does not exist. And this obviously does not resolve the problem. But we have to give the negation we sort of scope over the whole sentence, wide scope. So we say, what we're really saying is, when we say Zeus does not exist, what we're really saying is it is not the case that there exists exactly one X such that X kings the gods on Mount Olympus. Which is true, yeah. Nothing satisfies that property, right? That property is not instantiated. There does not exist exactly one X such that X kings the gods on Mount Olympus. The property of kinging the gods on Mount Olympus is not instantiated by anything. So this statement does not pick out Zeus and then deny that Zeus has the property of existence. It denies that the property of being king of the gods on Mount Olympus is instantiated by a unique thing. So Zeus does not exist. What that means is that the property of being king of the gods on Mount Olympus is not instantiated. So when we take everything there is in the most inclusive sense, we don't find anything that has this property of being king of the gods on Mount Olympus. So Russell thinks that, look, we can, we just don't need to postulate this, like non-existent object that is being denoted by the sentence, right? We can kind of analyze it away and instead talk about, properties that are or are not instantiated. Now, there are plenty of objections to Russell's theory. I'm not going to go through them here because this is not a video about Russell's theory. But there are plenty of objections to it. I do want to note a couple of points just that are relevant to Meinongianism, is that there do seem to be a class of cases in which Russell's theory gives the wrong answer. So consider, for instance, the round square is round. Now, some philosophers think that this is just analytically true, right? Just in virtue of the meanings of the terms. And I mean, you can see the intuition here, right? Like, the round square is round kind of seems like an utterly trivial claim. I'm saying that this round thing is round. Well, yeah, of course, if I've just stipulated that it's round, it's got to be, whatever's round is round, right? It's a tautology. But if you apply Russell's theory to this, we get there exists exactly one X, such that X is round and X is square, and X is round. And of course, Russell, this is false. This is false because there isn't anything that is both round and square. There doesn't exist anything that is both round and square. So Russell's theory arguably gives us the wrong answer, arguably, for certain cases of these analytic truths. Another problem arises with some of these cases of apparent relations between non-existent objects and real objects. So take Sherlock Holmes is more famous than any real detective. Okay, well, let's apply Russell's theory. First of all, we replace the proper name with a description. The man who lives at 221B Baker Street is more famous than any real detective. Then we apply Russell's analysis. There exists exactly one X such that X lives at 221B Baker Street and X is more famous than any real detective. But that statement is false. Obviously, yeah, because there's not a detective living at 221B Baker Street. I'm not sure if 221B Baker Street is even an actual place. But certainly, but in any case, no, the statement is false. Again, the Meinongian says, look, we can provide a much more straightforward analysis of these sorts of cases. So the round square there is a round square, and it has the property of being round. There is an object denoted by Sherlock Holmes, and that object is indeed more famous than any real detective. So, so the Meinongian approach is preferable to Russell's theory. Okay, well, I am currently able to pay all my bills, and if you would like to help me prevent my ability to pay my bills from becoming a denizen of Meinong's jungle, then you can sign up to my Patreon, where there's bonus content. If you sign up to the Hume tier, you get access to all sorts of bonus videos. There's quite a few on there now, and I'm uploading more of them about once a week. Or you can just throw me some cash via PayPal. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy, and I'm well qualified to do that since I've done a degree, a master's and a PhD in philosophy. And I also have a Discord which you can join if you want to talk about this stuff with other people. So anyway, that's the advert. Let's get back to Meinongianism. Okay, we've seen some of the motivations for Meinongianism. It's time to look at some of the objections. So one concern is, there's a very common view in philosophy that existence is not a genuine predicate. So this kind of view was expressed quite nicely by Hume. Hume gives the following kind of example. Let's say, I ask you to think of an apple, right? I can attribute various properties to the apple. It has a particular taste, texture, color, temperature. I can imagine an apple with a different color. I can imagine an apple with no color at all. I can imagine an invisible apple. Okay, now suppose I ask you to imagine an apple exactly like this, except that in addition, the apple exists, right? So there's two things, right? I'm asking you to imagine, first of all, an apple, and secondly, an existent apple. What's the difference, right? What's the difference between imagining an apple and imagining an existent apple? Well, it doesn't seem like there is any difference. I mean, anything that I imagine about the apple, I'm imagining that it exists. If the apple is red, it exists, because only things that exist can be red. If the apple is invisible, it exists. Only existing things can be invisible, and so on. The moral is that to think of something is just to think of that something existing, right? To think of an X is to think of an existent X. So existence is not a property that objects might have or lack. A little later, Kant expressed the same Humean idea when he was critiquing ontological arguments. He says, "Thus, when I think a thing, through whichever and however many predicates I like, even in its most thoroughgoing determination, not the least bit gets added to the thing when I posit in addition that this thing is, i.e., that the thing exists. For otherwise, what would exist would not be the same as what I had thought in my concept, but more than that, and I could not say that the very object of my concept exists." And of course, this is kind of view is also adopted in Russell's account. On Russell's theory, existence is not a property of individuals. To say that X exists is to say that the property of being X is instantiated by something. To say that X does not exist is to say that nothing instantiates the property of being X. So the denial that existence is a genuine property is a common view. Now, of course, if we're just denying that existence is a property, then the Meinongian simply rejects that claim. As she sees it, existence is a property of individuals, and she thinks that she has arguments for taking that view seriously. Now, to the Humean point that there is no distinction between imagining an apple and imagining an existent apple, well, we might say, look, this seems to presuppose that genuine properties must be visualizable, right? So like when I kind of have the mental image of an apple in my mind, and then when you ask me, oh, well, imagine an existent apple, I don't change the mental image, right? So existence isn't a visualizable property, but do we think that all genuine properties must be visualizable? Well, that seems very questionable. It seems like there are many things we can't visualize. Like, how would you visualize, say, Newton's law of universal gravitation, or the speed of sound, or the distinction between mereological nihilism and mereological universalism? I mean, of course, in all these cases, you can sort of come up with like symbols that stand for those things. I can kind of imagine like an equation or something that stands for the law of universal gravitation. But then, if that's enough to imagine something, then I can certainly imagine existence, because I can imagine a symbol that stands for that, the word existence. But it seems like, there are many things that we can't kind of conceptualize, there are many things that we can conceptualize, but that we can't really like come up with a mental image of. So, so it is with non-existent apples versus existent apples. We can perfectly well conceptualize the distinction. If I was asked to visualize either, well, I just end up picturing an apple, sure. But, I can conceptualize it. So, one thing I know, for instance, is that, okay, if you ask me to imagine an apple, and then you say, well, now imagine it's an existent apple. Okay, so imagine like a non-existent apple and an existent apple. Well, one of the things that is relevantly different between these is, look, I can't nourish myself with a non-existent apple. If I'm hungry, I'm not I'm not going to be able to satisfy that hunger with the non-existent apple, but I will be able to with the existent one. So there you go. I'm conceptualizing the difference. So to claim with Hume and Kant that not the least bit gets added to a thing when I posit in addition that it exists, that seems to just really be presupposing that existence is not a genuine property. I think that's what the Meinongian might say to that. Okay then. So another common objection to Meinongianism targets the distinction between existence and being. The idea is, according to the critic, right? The critic says, look, the Meinongian is saying that there are objects that do not have the property of existence, but nevertheless they have being in some broader sense. So Zeus does not exist, but Zeus has being. And this is what allows us to denote Zeus. So some objects exist, some objects do not exist, but all objects have being of some kind. Now, the trouble with this is it's just not at all clear how to make sense of the distinction between existence and being. And indeed, it sounds as if the Meinongian is simply using words in a non-standard way. So consider that I could similarly, I could use the word existence in a more restricted sense to refer only to concrete objects. And then I might say numbers do not exist. And when I say the words numbers do not exist, I seem to be contradicting the mathematical Platonists who argue that numbers do exist. But, suppose I add, well, there are abstract objects. Abstract objects have being, even though they don't exist. Well, in that case, it looks more like there's just a mere terminological difference between myself and the Platonist. I'm using the word exists only for concrete objects. The Platonist uses the word exists unrestrictedly to refer to whatever things there are, whatever things have being, regardless of what their properties are. I mean, of course, the Platonist does not think that numbers are concrete objects. So if exists means is concrete or has spatio-temporal location, then of course numbers do not exist. But there are numbers. Myself and the Platonist both agree on the substantive point. So the thought is, look, the Meinongian is in a similar situation. Given the ordinary use of the term exists, where what exists is just whatever there is in reality, the Meinongian actually is claiming that Zeus and the Golden Mountain and round squares and so on exist. They just exist in a different way. They have a different metaphysical status. And so look, something is either part of reality or it isn't. There aren't degrees of reality. Of course, different objects have different properties, but, even an object that just sort of, like a particle that flashes for a second before being annihilated, that exists, that has being, no less than the Eiffel Tower exists. An abstract object that is not even spatio-temporal, that exists no less than does the Eiffel Tower. And, these Meinongian objects, these Meinongian objects that the Meinongian is saying have being, this kind of shadowy being, well, they exist. The Meinongian is not really claiming that there are non-existent objects. She's just using words in a different way to the rest of us. Now, so this is as I said, fairly common objection. As stated, though, I think it's something of a straw man. Meinong himself denies that objects such as Zeus and the Golden Mountain and the round square have any form of being. More recent defenders of Meinongianism have followed this. So we can actually just grant that existence and being are synonymous. If Zeus has being, then Zeus exists. but Zeus doesn't have being. Zeus is a non-existent object and a non-being object. The Meinongian claim that there are objects that do not exist can just as easily be read as there are objects that do not have being. There are objects that are not part of reality, no matter how broadly we interpret the notion of reality. So Zeus, the round square, the golden mountain, none of these things exist. I should note, although I say this is a bit of a straw man, I mean, Meinong's own theory of objects was a bit more complicated. So he actually did draw a distinction between existence and what he called subsistence, where like abstract objects subsist. But he also said that there were objects that just have no being of any kind. In any case, more recent Meinongians tend to, just say, yeah, there's just existence, right? There's existence and non-existence. Existence is just the same as being, but there are objects that they don't exist and they don't have being. Okay, so the Meinongian claims that there are objects that don't exist. There are objects that have no being. Now, with this point clarified, we run head-on into a different problem, which is, we might argue, well, if that's what the Meinongian is saying, then they're just saying something completely incoherent, because to say that there are x's just means that there exist x's, right? There is an x just means there exists an x. So when I say, there is a round square, well, that just means that there exists a round square. Or if I say there are non-existent objects, that just means that there exist non-existent objects. Certainly this is how we interpret the existential quantifier, or the particular quantifier, in classical logic. So in classical logic, if there is a round square, that would be translated as there exists an x such that x is round and x is square. And there is no distinction between there is an x such that x is round and x is square, and there exists an x such that x is round and x is square. And I think this can claim some support from our use of language, our linguistic intuitions, right? If I was to say in ordinary circumstances, there is a round square, well, you'd probably take me to be claiming that there exists a round square, and you'd say that my statement is false. If I say there is a golden mountain, you'd say, no, that's crazy. Of course there isn't. So, I mean, look, if there's no distinction between there is or there are and there exists, then the claim is Meinongianism can't get off the ground. However, the Meinongian can respond. Well, first of all, although classical logic draws no distinction between there is and there exists, there are now pretty well-developed logics that do draw that distinction. This distinction is made in certain forms of free logic, for example. Free logic allows us to quantify over non-existent things. It allows for terms that do not refer to any existing thing, and will add an explicit existence predicate. So we can distinguish between terms referring to existing things and terms referring to things that don't exist. So when I say, so this, the formula in classical logic that is interpreted as saying there exists an x such that x is round and x is square just is read as there is an x such that x is round and x is square. And if we want to say there exists a round square, we need an explicit existence predicate, right? There is an x such that x exists and x is round and x is square. Insofar as classical logic does not allow a distinction between there is and there exists, the Meinongian says, well, that's just a limitation of classical logic. Maybe classical logic is fine for the domain of existing things, but it doesn't hold universally, right? So the Meinongian may add as well that there are, well, first of all, there are independent reasons to draw a distinction between there is and there exists, and we've already seen those reasons in the arguments for Meinongianism that I gave earlier. And they might argue that this distinction is implicitly found in ordinary language. So, basically for the reasons explained earlier. So recall again, it seems perfectly ordinary to give a substantial answer to a question like, what is Gallifrey? I say, Gallifrey is a planet. Gallifrey is the home of the Time Lords, even though I don't think Gallifrey exists. I take it that Gallifrey has properties, despite its non-existence. But I think, moreover, it's not clear how telling this appeal to ordinary language is anyway. Suppose it were true, like that in. So let's just say that in English, it's true that there is just means there exists. Well, we might simply take that as a kind of idiosyncrasy of English. Our considered philosophical positions may introduce technical distinctions that are not found in ordinary language. And of course, the opponent of Meinongianism can make the same point. Even if ordinary language draws a distinction between there is and there exists, this doesn't show that this distinction is coherent or otherwise acceptable, right? Like sometimes ordinary language is misleading. So, the fact that, like, if it is a fact that ordinary English, that in ordinary English there is and there exists are synonymous, I don't think that actually tells against Meinongianism, because Meinongianism is it's a philosophical view. It's maybe introducing a technical distinction. Now, of course, we can still sort of push the problem here. We can say, well, look, Meinongianism is just unintelligible, right? We can't make sense of the idea that there are objects that don't exist. We can't make sense of like quantification of over objects that don't exist. So yeah, it's just unintelligible, right? This technical distinction that the Meinongian is trying to draw. I mean, I guess at that point, it's not, I don't know what more can really be said, right? I mean, all you can do is show how the theory is supposed to work, give the arguments for it. You can sort of show, like, well, here's a sort of logical formalization of the theory, and, hope that will communicate the idea. So, yeah, but maybe eventually you just end up running into, I don't know, okay, maybe it just is unintelligible. What more can be said? There is another response to this problem that's available to the Meinongian, and this is proposed by Graham Priest in his book Towards Non-Being. So Priest argues that particular quantification should not be read as either there is or there exists. So instead, it means for some. So take again, this formula that standardly would be read, there exists an x such that x is round and x is square. Well, what Priest says is the Meinongian should instead read this as saying something x is such that x is round and x is square. Or for some x, x is round and x is square, right? Some x is such that x is round and x is square. Well, this doesn't involve any claim about what there exists or about what there is, right? We're just saying for some x is round and x is square. But we're not saying, there is an x such that x is round and x is square. If we wish to claim that there is or there exists a round square, again, we need the explicit existence predicate. We'd need to say some x is such that x exists and x is round and x is square. So the thought is the Meinongian can just grant to the critic that there is no distinction, intelligible distinction, between there is and there exists, but then they can retain the Meinongian idea of reference to non-existent objects. Of course, on this view, we would not say that there are non-existent objects, right? The answer to the question, are there non-existent objects, is actually no, right? There are no non-existent objects. But we can still refer to non-existent objects. We can still make claims about them where these claims are true or false in virtue of the properties of those non-existent objects. So, Priest says, well, if we adopt this kind of view, then we have an interpretation of the particular quantifier where that doesn't involve ontological commitment in any sense, to the objects that are quantified over, even if there's no coherent distinction between there is and there exists. Of course, if we're doubting that there's a coherent distinction between there is and there exists, then are we going to say that, it's legitimate to sort of assert for some x that x has such and such properties if x doesn't exist? Maybe not. Maybe that's not coherent either. But anyway, that's what Priest suggests. So, even if we grant that Meinongianism is a coherent view, we still have the worry that this involves a commitment to an extremely inflationary ontology. It violates Occam's razor. Occam's razor, which says, do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Indeed, it's hard to imagine a philosophical position that multiplies entities as promiscuously as Meinongianism does. Meinongianism admits every object imaginable, and more besides. So simplicity considerations tell against Meinongianism. I mean, if there is any, if there is any theoretical virtue of simplicity at all, then it must, cut against Meinongianism before it cuts against anything else. But the Meinongian will say, well, we have to be cautious about applying Occam's razor here. Meinongianism is not ontologically inflationary because the Meinongian is not ontologically committed to all of these entities. So, yes, something is such that it is both round and square, but this thing doesn't exist. It doesn't have being in any sense. So it isn't postulated as part of our ontology. I mean, at least that's the claim. Now, maybe that's not coherent, but the point is, if it is coherent, if Meinongianism is coherent, then it isn't clear why there would be any issue with multiplying these non-existent entities. And if it isn't coherent, then obviously it fails for other reasons. But as long as it's coherent, as long as we're granting that, okay, there are things that just have no being in any sense. Well, why would it matter if there's why would it matter if there's loads of them, right? I mean, in general, I think, these sorts of epistemic principles, there are specific reasons why we follow them, specific contexts in which they hold. If some theory entails that among the existing concrete objects there are round squares and Greek gods, well, maybe that's a problem. But prima facie, there doesn't seem to be any reason why the domain of non-existent things would be limited at all. They're not why would it be? Why would that be limited by simplicity considerations? Again, assuming it's coherent to propose that domain at all, Occam's razor would not apply. Okay, probably the most serious objection to Meinongianism is that it leads to various paradoxes. So, Meinong's original theory involved two core principles. First, there is the principle of independence of being from being so, or as Meinong put it in a different language, sign from so sign. I'm not pronouncing those correctly. But anyway, the principle of independence of being from being so. Being from being so. Essentially, this claims that the existence or being of an object is independent of the properties of the object. So the existence of an object is independent of the object's being a particular way, such as being blue or being round or being a musician or whatever. An object may have whatever properties at all independently of whether the object exists. Second, there is the characterization principle, which says that an object has exactly those properties that it is characterized as having. Any description refers to an object that satisfies the description. So the golden mountain is both golden and a mountain. The round square is both round and square. These two principles allow for non-existent objects to give us the right answers to the puzzles that we started with in the video. And this also gives us fairly straightforward identity conditions for objects. So for any set of properties, there is exactly one object with those properties. So two characterizations pick out the same object just in case they describe the same properties. So we'll call the conjunction of these two principles naive Meinongianism. Now, first of all, naive Meinongianism immediately leads to contradiction, because according to this theory, the round square is both round and square, which is to say that it's both round and not round. So the naive Meinongian is committed to the claim that some objects have contradictory properties. Obviously, plenty of philosophers find this unacceptable, right? Logic is totally general. Even if there are objects that do not exist, they must also obey the laws of logic. Now, the usual response to this is just to, bite the bullet and to say that, well, yeah, some non-existent objects are indeed contradictory. The law of non-contradiction only holds for those objects that exist or that could exist. It doesn't need to hold for objects that are impossible. Certainly it would be a problem if Meinongianism entailed that there are existing things that have contradictory properties, but the Meinongian only claims that contradictory things are non-existent. There exist no contradictory things, And well, that's the right result. In fact, not only that, but contradictory things are impossible. They have the property of impossibility. So if we claim that the law of non-contradiction does not hold for non-existent objects, perhaps that shows that logic will need to be modified. But we saw earlier that the Meinongian is already committed to rejecting classical logic. So maybe that's not such a big deal for them. But in any case, Meinongians tend to just accept that there are going to be there are contradictory objects, although none of them exist. So a similar sort of difficulty, although maybe a bit more of a problem, is raised by incomplete objects. The characterization principle allows for objects whose properties are not fully determined. And, this actually fits with much fictional discourse. So think about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is the object that has exactly those properties attributed in the stories about Sherlock Holmes. But this leaves many properties unspecified. For instance, whether Holmes ate breakfast on the morning of the 1st of January 1890. The proposition, Holmes ate breakfast on the 1st of January 1890, is neither true nor false, because there's no fact of the matter whether Holmes had that property. So we do want to allow for there to be objects that are incomplete in this sense, where so for some given property there just isn't a fact about whether the object has that property. But now suppose that I stipulate the following object. There is an object that has the property of being a chemist and no other properties. Just being a chemist. So, by the characterization principle, I am successfully referring to an object that has the single property of being a chemist. Now, the worry is this. I'm considering an object that has exactly one property. But this is to say that the object has the property of having exactly one property. Presumably the property of being a chemist is distinct from the property of having exactly one property. After all, there are plenty of chemists with other features. So it follows from this that the object has at least two properties. So we have again a kind of a contradiction here. We have an object which has exactly one property but also has at least two properties. Now, it's not so clear that the Meinongian can cheerfully accept this contradiction because, remember, the characterization principle says that an object has exactly those properties that it is characterized as having. But I wasn't intending to characterize this object as contradictory. I'm just saying, this is just an object with a single property. But I've ended up with a contradictory object. So this seems to really push on the characterization principle. The most serious challenge to naive Meinongianism concerns the property of existence. According to the characterization principle, there is an object for every set of properties. But remember that for the Meinongian, existence is a property. So just take the existent golden mountain, and we characterize it as follows. X is golden, and X is a mountain, and X is existent. These are the characterizing properties of the object. Well, by the characterization principle, we now have an existent golden mountain. But, that's not so good, right? It looks like Meinongianism now just ends up entailing a kind of trivialism. Just everything exists. Any object at all I can characterize in any way whatsoever, and then just add that it's existent. And according to Meinongianism, it exists. So these sorts of difficulties have generally been taken to refute naive Meinongianism. I think even most Meinongians tend to say that, naive Meinongianism doesn't work. So in response, Meinongians have had to restrict the characterization principle. There are various strategies that have been used to do this. I'm just going to discuss one of them, which is the distinction between nuclear and extranuclear properties. So in some ways, this distinction is kind of analogous to the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic properties. But basically, nuclear properties define an object's nature. They tell us what the object really is, or what the object essentially is. The nuclear properties characterize what the object is. The extranuclear properties are in some sense external to the object. They don't define what the object is, but rather concern the status of the object. So perhaps the best way to get a handle on this is just to give some examples, right? Some examples of nuclear properties would be being red, being tall, being radioactive, being composed of H2O, being golden, being a mountain, etc. And this also includes activities and relations like punching somebody, loving somebody, having been loved by somebody, being the most famous detective in the world, and so on. So, it's not quite the intrinsic-extrinsic distinction. Extranuclear properties, by contrast, will include sort of ontological properties like being existent or being fictional, or modal properties like being possible, being impossible, being necessary. Now, look, obviously, this distinction is not totally clear, but hopefully this gives you some sense of what the Meinongian is getting at. Okay, so we have this distinction between the properties that characterize what the object is, and then properties that concern its status. And with this distinction in hand, the claim is that the characterization principle must be modified so that it involves only predicates that pick out the nuclear properties. Objects are characterized by their nuclear properties, not their extranuclear properties. An object has exactly those nuclear properties that it is characterized as having. So for any set of nuclear properties, there is an object that has exactly that set of nuclear properties and no other nuclear properties. But the characterization principle does not extend to extranuclear properties. And existence is an extranuclear property. So existence doesn't determine what an object is. Interestingly, it's worth maybe noting this seems to concede a point to the whole idea that existence isn't a predicate, right? Or existence isn't a genuine property. It's no, well, existence is a property, but it's a special kind of property. So it's still a property, but it's that argument that existence isn't a property was maybe still getting at something, right? So anyway, when I say the existent golden mountain, that fails to pick out an object because only the nuclear properties can be used to denote an object. This also solves the problem of incomplete objects. So take the object characterized by the single property of being a chemist. Being a chemist is a nuclear property, but the number of nuclear properties that an object has is an extranuclear property. So the property of having exactly one property, that's not a nuclear property, and so it doesn't characterize the object. So we can use this to solve some of these problems. Of course, there are some fairly obvious difficulties here. First of all, this distinction between nuclear and extranuclear properties is kind of hard to make sense of. When I was explaining it, I sort of hand-waved the concerns, and unfortunately, it's not clear that Meinongians have ever managed to do much more than that. The distinction does feel kind of arbitrary and sort of gerrymandered. Anytime there is a property that raises trouble for the characterization principle, we just say, oh, well, that's an extranuclear property, so the principle doesn't apply. It's not really very satisfying. What we really want is a principled way to draw the distinction. So, this like Meinong's jungle, the repository of non-existent objects, it shouldn't just be gerrymandered, right? Presumably there's some principle about what counts as a nuclear property and what counts as an extranuclear property. So this is a big challenge for Meinongians who take this view. But there's a second issue here, which is restricting the characterization principle seems to be required in order to avoid these problems that I mentioned, these paradoxes. But restricting the characterization principle arguably undermines the motivation for Meinongianism. Because, if existence is a predicate, even if it's extranuclear, then it seems like a person can think about and refer to the existent golden mountain just as well as they can think about and refer to the golden mountain, or to Zeus, or to phlogiston, or to the planet Vulcan. So, consider, for instance, the proposition, the existent golden mountain is a problem for Meinongians. Well, that sentence has the subject-predicate form. It seems to be true. It seems to refer to an existent golden mountain. It seems to denote an existent golden mountain. If we say, Frank Zappa was a musician, works by the name Frank Zappa denoting this person, this object, then, okay, in this case, the existent golden mountain, well, looks like that denotes an object. Or if I say, like, Delia fears that her friend died on the existent golden mountain, well, there's a difference between a mental state about a golden mountain and a mental state about an existent golden mountain. I wouldn't fear that somebody died on a non-existent golden mountain, right? You only fear that they might have died on the existent one. So the thing is that in these cases, the Meinongian is forced to give what we might call like a non-Meinongian interpretation of these claims. We can't take these sentences at face value as legitimately denoting an existent golden mountain. But then, okay, there must be a non-Meinongian semantics that works for apparent reference to non-existent objects. And that might lead us to doubt the Meinongian semantics in the more familiar cases that we saw at the start of this video. Or similarly, if I say the existent golden mountain is existent, well, that has the same form as the round square is round, but we're not inclined to take it to be analytically true. Or at least if it is true, it certainly isn't true in virtue of denoting an existent golden mountain. So, again, even the Meinongian is forced to accept a non-Meinongian account in this case. So, I guess the worry is, like, first we have this problem that there's like this arbitrary distinction between nuclear and extra-nuclear properties. That looks very kind of gerrymandered. But then in addition, it seems like the Meinongian has to offer a completely different theory of meaning and reference for certain classes of statements, where it's really not clear like that there's any sort of principled reason. Like there's no like when I say the existent golden mountain is a problem for Meinongians, it looks like you should give the same sort of analysis of that as you would say for Frank Zappa is a musician, or whatever else, or I say fire is a problem for so and so, right? I mean, it doesn't. It seems like the Meinongian ends up giving a different theory of meaning in these cases, and that looks sort of arbitrary. So that's another worry. But with all of that said, I think I've said quite a lot about this, and this is just an introduction, so I think I'm going to leave it there. Well, thank you very much for watching. And, if you have watched, again, consider signing up to the Patreon. Lots of bonus content there. And if not that, then, give the video a like, leave a comment. Any kind of engagement helps the channel. So, thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye, everybody.